My name is Claire Dawson. I am 32 years old, and I used to think family gatherings were about warmth and tradition. But in my family, holidays always came with comparisons. My father never missed a chance to praise my younger sister Sophie, the glamorous one, the so-called independent success, while I was left sitting quietly at the edge of the table. I told myself to stay calm, to let it pass, to carry my own life in silence. Until that Christmas Eve, when in front of everyone, my father lifted his glass and said the words that cut deeper than ever. In that moment, I realized I had a truth powerful enough to change everything. What would happen if the daughter, who had always been overlooked, finally spoke up? Stay with me, because this Christmas party turned into a night my family will never forget. Let me take you back to where it began. The living room looked like a Christmas card. A tall tree sparkled in the corner, silver and red ornaments catching the glow of the string lights. Candles flickered on the mantel, and the smell of baked ham and cinnamon hung in the air. Relatives filled the space, their voices overlapping in a noisy chorus of greetings and chatter. My father, Richard Dawson, stood near the bar cart, a glass of Cabernet in hand, his face flushed from the warmth of the room. He spotted me and waved his smile broad. "Claire, there you are." I smiled back, forcing a calm expression, though my nerves hummed beneath the surface. Sophie, my younger sister, was already at the center of attention, dressed in a fitted emerald green dress with just the right amount of shimmer under the lights. Her blonde hair was styled perfectly, her heels clicking on the hardwood as she moved from one group to another, soaking in the admiration. Guests leaned toward her with interest, laughing at her stories. She looked like she belonged in a holiday magazine spread. I hung my coat, smoothed my sweater, and made my way to the dining room. The table stretched nearly wall-to-wall, set with fine china red napkins folded neatly and crystal glasses catching the glow of the chandelier. My Aunt Mary was arranging a tray of cookies while Uncle Tom was pouring drinks for the cousins. Everyone seemed settled into their roles, comfortable, happy. I took a seat at the far end, hoping to blend in. I had learned over the years that the less attention I drew, the smoother the evening went. From where I sat, I had a clear view of Sophie, her smile dazzling as she accepted another compliment. Richard hovered nearby, clearly proud. Dinner began, the clinking of silverware and cheerful chatter filling the air. Conversation circled easily around holiday travel, gift exchanges, and the cold snap hitting Colorado. I listened quietly, passing the breadbasket, nodding at jokes staying invisible. Then my father stood, raising his glass high, his voice cutting through the noise. "Everyone, I want to take a moment," he said, pausing as the room fell into silence. "My daughter Sophie has shown us all what it means to be responsible, successful, and truly independent." All eyes turned to her. Sophie's cheeks glowed as she beamed, her hand resting delicately on the back of her chair. She didn't protest, didn't downplay, she just let the praise wash over her. Richard continued, his voice swelling with pride. "She doesn't need help from anyone. Look at what she's achieved. Her career, her apartment, her car, the way she carries herself. She is proof of what hard work and focus can accomplish." My chest tightened as I cut into the roasted ham on my plate, forcing my expression to remain neutral. The words slid into me like sharp glass. I had heard versions of this speech for years, but somehow it cut deeper in front of an entire party filled with family and neighbors. Richard's eyes swept the table, then landed on me. Unlike Claire, who still spends too much time behind a computer, he let out a chuckle, clearly meant to be lighthearted, but the sting was sharp and humiliating. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Sophie's lips curved into a polished smile, her gaze flicking toward me with unmistakable satisfaction. I swallowed a sip of water, my throat dry, my heart racing. The candlelight flickered across the tablecloth, and for a moment I considered standing and leaving, escaping into the cold night just to breathe. But instead I stayed. I glanced around. My Aunt Jennifer caught my eye for just a second, her brow furrowed, as if she knew I was holding something back. Across the table, cousins avoided my gaze, focusing instead on their plates. It was as though the entire room was complicit in this quiet humiliation, and I was expected to absorb it as usual. Sophie tilted her head and said softly enough for only those nearby to hear, "Thank you, Dad." It means the world to be recognized for working so hard. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. The words echoed in my head, hard work independent, doesn't need help. I clenched the utensil, feeling a heat rise in my chest that had nothing to do with the wine. The room erupted into polite applause glasses, raised in Sophie's honor. Richard leaned down to kiss the top of her head, beaming with fatherly pride. My hands shook slightly as I set my fork down, hiding the tremor under the table. I smiled faintly, lips pressed together, but my mind was already turning. This night was supposed to be another rehearsal of the same script Sophie celebrated me dismissed. But the way the words hung in the air, the smugness on Sophie's face, the certainty in my father's tone, something in me shifted. I straightened in my chair, quietly steadying myself. The warmth of the room pressed against me, the sounds of clinking glasses and laughter all around. No one had any idea what I was about to say or how quickly this celebration would change. And as I took another slow sip of water, I realized I didn't feel nervous anymore. I felt ready. The voices around me faded into a blur as I set my glass down on the table. The cheer in the room carried on, but inside me something had shifted. I wasn't the same woman who used to sit quietly through these gatherings, smiling politely while Sophie basked in attention. My chest rose and fell slowly, and with each breath I felt a little stronger, a little steadier. As my father launched into another story about Sophie's so-called promotion, my mind slipped away to years earlier. I could see myself sitting in this very house maybe 5 Christmases ago, listening to the same refrain. Sophie had just landed her job at the boutique in Cherry Creek, and Dad treated it like she had become the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. He called her a rising star, a go-getter, someone who knew how to stand on her own 2 feet. Then he looked at me and said I should follow her example. That night I had gone home in silence. My apartment back then was tiny, just 1 bedroom, and a desk shoved against the wall where I worked late into the night. I remember staring at my computer screen until my eyes blurred, building a website from scratch, negotiating with suppliers who barely knew my name, packaging orders on my living room floor. I had no glossy title, no corner office, but I had grit, and I knew I was building something that mattered. The years rolled forward, and so did the comparisons. Easter brunch, 4th of July barbecues, Thanksgiving dinners, always the same script. Sophie with her expensive outfits and perfect hair, Dad praising her independence, me fading into the background. I learned to keep my victories private, because in their eyes, they weren't real victories anyway. To them, I was just tinkering on a computer, wasting time. I could still remember the sting of my father's words during one summer cookout. He had leaned back in his chair, beer in hand, and told my cousins that Sophie was the reliable one, the daughter who would make him proud. Then he nodded toward me and said I needed to get serious about life. The laughter that followed burned into me so deeply I can still hear it if I close my eyes. What no one saw was the way I pushed harder after each slight. While Sophie posed in front of her new apartment with a glass of champagne, I was negotiating bulk orders from manufacturers in Oregon and Texas. While she bragged about a shopping trip to Los Angeles, I was filling my Subaru with camping gear shipments to drop off at the warehouse in Commerce City. And while Dad dismissed my work as playing around my bank account, told a very different story. By 2020, I had hit my first $500,000 in revenue. I remember staring at the number on my screen, tears stinging my eyes. I wanted to tell Dad so badly to hear even a small word of pride, but something in me knew it wouldn't matter. He believed in what he could see: a store with racks of dresses, customers walking in and out, Sophie smiling behind the counter. He couldn't picture a woman making money from a laptop. As these memories filled my mind, the sound of laughter from the dining room pulled me back. Sophie was showing off a new diamond bracelet, turning her wrist so the light hit it just right. The guests oot and aid. Dad chuckled proudly, and I felt the familiar sting tighten my chest. Aunt Jennifer leaned slightly toward me, her voice low. "You doing okay, Claire?" Her eyes were soft, knowing. She had always been the one to notice when I pulled back into myself. I gave her a small nod, though the truth pressed heavy on my tongue. She patted my hand and turned her attention back to the table, but I caught the flicker of doubt in her gaze. She suspected more than she let on. I picked at my plate, pushing green beans around while Sophie launched into a story about a shopping trip in Chicago. She talked about designer sales champagne toasts, a rooftop dinner. Everyone laughed at her quick wit, never once questioning how a retail manager's paycheck could fund that kind of lifestyle. Inside, my thoughts twisted tighter. 2 years earlier, Sophie had shown up at my apartment, mascara streaked down her cheeks, begging me to help cover her rent. She said she was drowning, that her credit cards were maxed, that she couldn't let Dad find out. I could still see her hands gripping mine, promising she would pay me back, that this was temporary. My heart ached for her then, and I agreed to wire her $4,000 a month until she got back on her feet. I thought it would last a few months. I thought she would cut back on spending, maybe downsize her apartment, take on extra shifts. But instead, the money became her lifeline to live a lie. The new apartment in Cherry Creek, the car with leather seats, the endless string of handbags, all of it funded by my so-called hobby. Now here she was glowing under Christmas lights, wearing another expensive dress, letting Dad praise her independence. I pressed my palms flat against the tablecloth, steadying myself. The clink of glasses rang out as Dad topped off Sophie's wine. To success, he declared. To doing things the right way, to living responsibly. He glanced toward me with a smirk that felt like a slap. Maybe one day Claire will find her path too. Heat surged up my neck. I drew in a slow breath, the cinnamon and pine heavy in the air, and felt the weight of years pressing against me. The quiet humiliation, the sacrifices no one knew about, the nights I stayed up until dawn, building my business while Sophie slept in silk sheets I had effectively paid for. I looked across the table at Sophie. She smiled sweetly, tilting her head in mock humility as everyone clapped again. She had no idea her perfect image balanced on a thread, and I was holding the scissors. I reached for my glass of water again, my hand steady this time. The chatter rose, forks scraped against plates, but I hardly heard any of it. My pulse had slowed, and for the first time in years I felt completely calm. The moment was close. I could sense it, the air around me almost humming. I knew that tonight would not end the way Sophie or my father expected. It was 2 years ago when Sophie showed up at my apartment in downtown Denver on a gray Sunday afternoon, her mascara smeared and her shoulders shaking. I had been unpacking a shipment of camping stoves in my living room, the floor crowded with boxes, when I heard her frantic knock. She stood in the doorway, clutching her handbag like it was a lifeline, and burst into tears the moment I let her inside. "I can't do this anymore," she cried, collapsing onto my couch. "The bills keep piling up. My credit cards are maxed. I am 3 weeks behind on rent. If Dad finds out, he will never look at me the same way again." I remember setting the box cutter down on the coffee table and sitting beside her, my hand resting awkwardly on her shoulder. She smelled faintly of expensive perfume, the kind I knew came in little bottles with 3-figure price tags. I asked her what had happened, and she poured it out in a rush. The apartment in Cherry Creek cost nearly $3,000 a month. The car loan was eating her alive. The shopping trips she posted on Instagram, the fancy dinners, the designer handbags, all of it had been charged to credit cards she could no longer pay. "Please, Claire," she begged, gripping my hands with cold fingers. "Just until I get promoted. I am next in line to move up to district manager. They promised me. Once that happens, I will pay you back every dollar." Her eyes were wide and desperate, and despite the ache in my chest, I believed her. She was my little sister. We had fought, sure, but I never wanted to see her crumble like that. I nodded slowly, though my stomach knotted. "I can send you some money," I told her, "enough to help you breathe. But this has to be temporary." That first transfer was $4,000. I told myself it was a bridge, a short-term fix, while Sophie steadied her feet. But the months slid by, and the requests continued. Each time she promised it was the last. Each time she swore she was on the edge of getting ahead. By the end of that first year, I had sent her nearly $50,000. I could have bought a house with that money or reinvested it in Summit provisions, but instead I kept wiring it to Sophie, covering rent and car payments and minimum balances on her swelling credit card debt. I told no one, not even Aunt Jennifer, who might have seen through Sophie's facade long before anyone else. What made it worse was the way Sophie carried herself in public. On social media, she looked radiant, posting photos from rooftop bars, wearing new coats and handbags, dining in trendy restaurants. Friends left comments about how inspiring she was, how successful. Dad believed every word she told him. He bragged at church potlucks that Sophie had been promoted, that her store outperformed every other location, that she was on track to lead the entire region. Meanwhile, my bank account was draining $4,000 each month to keep her fantasy alive. I bit my tongue during family dinners as Dad praised her independence. I forced myself to swallow the bitterness when Sophie rolled her eyes at me for wearing the same boots I had worn last winter. She lived like a star while I paid the bills, and no one knew. I tried to encourage her quietly. "Sophie, maybe you should move into a smaller place," I suggested one evening when she called me in tears about another overdue notice. "You could save money." But she dismissed it instantly. "I can't, Claire. My image matters. People expect me to live a certain way." Image. That was the word she clung to, like reputation could keep the lights on. I stopped arguing. I kept wiring the money. By the second year, I knew the truth she refused to admit. Sophie wasn't climbing anywhere. Her salary stayed at $52,000 a year, hardly enough to sustain the life she flaunted. The so-called promotion never came. The bonus she bragged about at last Christmas was nothing but another invention. And yet she kept letting Dad hold her up as the example while using me as the cautionary tale. I carried that knowledge like a stone in my chest, silent and heavy. I told myself it was family duty. I told myself I was protecting Dad from disappointment. I told myself Sophie would turn it around. But the longer it went, the clearer it became. She wasn't just leaning on me. She was building her throne on my back. Now, as I sat at the Christmas table, the lights glittering and the wine glasses shining, I looked at Sophie with her polished smile and her emerald dress. Guests leaned in, hanging on her every word, while my father's chest swelled with pride. None of them knew that behind the sparkle was desperation, that every piece of jewelry and every glass of champagne was bought with money I had quietly handed over. I gripped my napkin in my lap, feeling the texture of the linen between my fingers. The memory of Sophie's trembling voice that first night at my apartment still echoed, but it no longer stirred pity. It stirred anger, steady and sharp. She had begged me for help, and I had given it. I had given more than I should have. But sitting there now with everyone clapping at her story about a shopping spree in Chicago, I understood something. She never planned to climb out of the hole. She had simply learned to live inside it, decorating the walls with borrowed things, trusting me to keep the ground from collapsing beneath her. I lifted my eyes and caught her looking at me across the table. For a split second, our gazes locked. She smiled, but behind it I saw the flicker of nerves, a tiny shadow in her otherwise flawless performance. Maybe she sensed that I had reached my limit. Maybe she knew that tonight, in front of everyone, I might finally stop protecting her. I set my napkin down carefully, my heartbeat steady now. The hum of conversation filled the room again, but in my mind all I could hear was the quiet truth I had carried for 2 years. And for the first time I wasn't afraid to let it out. The clatter of forks and the low hum of conversation filled the dining room as my father rose from his chair again. His voice boomed over the table, warm with pride, and everyone quieted. He lifted his glass high, the chandelier light catching the red swirl of wine. "I want to take another moment," he said, his eyes shining as they settled on Sophie. "My youngest daughter has made all of us proud. She has shown us how determination pays off, how a young woman can make it on her own in this world." Guests nodded and murmured their agreement. Sophie lowered her lashes, pretending to be modest, but I could see the curve of her lips, the satisfied smirk she tried to hide. She loved this. She always had. My father continued his words, coming easier with each sip of wine. "She doesn't lean on anyone. She doesn't need help. She pays her own bills, lives. In that beautiful apartment, drives a car she earned herself. Look at her tonight, successful and independent. That is what I call responsibility." The words hit me like a hammer. I had heard them in different versions countless times, but tonight, they felt louder, sharper, crueler. I sat still, my knife pressed against the roasted potatoes, my appetite gone. My chest burned not from shame anymore, but from the pressure of the truth pressing against my throat. Sophie tilted her head just enough to catch my eye, her smile widening, as if to say, "You will never measure up." She smoothed the bracelet on her wrist, letting it sparkle in the candlelight, and whispered to the cousin next to her about a recent trip to Chicago. They both laughed, and I saw my father beam. I heard a laugh too, but it came from my own mouth, quiet and bitter. Aunt Jennifer glanced at me from across the table, her brow furrowed. She knew something was stirring. My father tapped his glass against Sophie's, the ringing sound echoing through the room. "This is what hard work looks like," he said proudly. "And maybe one day Claire will follow her sister's example." That was it. The line I had heard 100 times before. My hands no longer trembled. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate, set my fork down with care, and pushed my chair back just slightly so the wood creaked against the floor. The chatter died down as a few heads turned toward me. I straightened in my seat, feeling the heat of the fireplace on my back, the smell of cinnamon heavy in the air. I could see Sophie watching me now, her smile stiffening, the confidence in her eyes flickering like a candle about to be snuffed out. My father looked puzzled. "Claire," I kept my expression calm, almost pleasant, my voice steady. "Dad, you say Sophie doesn't need help from anyone? That she is independent, that she pays for everything on her own?" He nodded quickly, ready to affirm it, but I didn't let him. I smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Then you'll be glad to know she won't need the $4,000 I have been sending her every month." The words slipped into the air like a stone dropped into a still pond. The sound of conversation stopped. Forks froze in midair. Glasses hovered forgotten. The silence that followed was louder than any laughter we had heard all night. Sophie's face drained of color, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came. My father blinked, confused, his glass lowering slowly to the table. Guests looked from me to Sophie, their expressions shifting from shock to curiosity, waiting for someone to break the stillness. I took another sip of water, my hands steady, and set the glass down. Around me, the party had paused. Christmas lights twinkled behind Sophie's frozen smile. Aunt Mary coughed softly, trying to mask her discomfort, but it only made the silence more unbearable. Finally, my father spoke, his voice rough. "What did you just say?" I folded my hands in my lap, my heart pounding but my voice even. "I said Sophie won't need my $4,000 a month anymore. After all, she is successful and independent, isn't she?" The tension in the room snapped like a taut string. Guests shifted in their seats, whispers began, and Sophie's hand flew to her necklace. She shook her head quickly, her eyes darting around the table, searching for an escape. "Dad, please," she whispered, but her voice cracked. "It's not what it sounds like." But I kept my eyes on her, calm and steady, and for the first time in years I didn't look away. My father blinked at me as if he had misheard. He leaned forward, squinting slightly, his glass of wine still in his hand. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the heater kicking on in the hallway. Conversation had died instantly. Every eye around that table darted between me and Sophie, waiting for someone to explain what I had just said. I let the silence stretch a moment longer, then I spoke again, slow and steady. $4,000 every month for the past 2 years. The words rolled across the room like thunder. A fork clattered onto a plate near the end of the table. One of my cousins gasped softly. Even the kids in the living room seemed to have quieted, sensing something was happening. Sophie let out a sharp laugh that sounded far too brittle. "Claire, what are you even talking about?" she said quickly, her eyes flicking nervously toward Dad. "That's not true." I didn't move, didn't flinch. My voice was level, almost calm. "It is true. I have the transfers in my bank records if you'd like to see them. $96,000 in total." Her cheeks blanched. She reached for her glass, and I noticed her hand trembling as she lifted it. She set it back down without drinking. Dad's face darkened as he turned toward her, confusion tightening his features. "Sophie, She shook her head frantically, strands of blonde hair falling loose from her perfect curls. Dad, she's making it sound worse than at Island. Worse than it is. I cut in my tone sharper now. You begged me, Sophie. You came to my apartment crying that you couldn't make rent, that your credit cards were maxed, that you would pay me back as soon as you got promoted. Remember that Sophie's lips parted, but no words came out. Her eyes darted to the relatives at the table, but all she saw were stares, some shocked, some pitying, a few outright judgmental. My father set his glass down with a hard clink, his hand shaking. Sophie, answer me directly. Have you been taking money from your sister? Tears welled in her eyes. I was going to pay her back, she whispered, her voice breaking. I just needed some time. A wave of murmurs rippled across the room. Aunt Mary clutched her napkin to her chest. Uncle Tom shook his head slowly. My cousins shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. My father's jaw clenched, his voice rising. For 2 years, I have been bragging to friends and family about your independence, and you have been living off your sister's money. It wasn't charity, Sophie cried, her voice cracking. It was a loan. A loan, I said, my tone icy. A loan with no terms, no interest, no end date. A loan you never once acknowledged when Dad called me a failure in front of everyone. She covered her face with her hands, sobs racking her shoulders. Her expensive bracelet caught the light as it slipped down her wrist, a sharp contrast to the picture of despair she was now. Dad pushed back from the table, so suddenly his chair screeched against the hardwood. He stood looming over Sophie, his face red. You told me you were making $90,000 a year. You said you had been promoted. Sophie's voice came out small, choked. I just didn't want you to be disappointed in me. The irony of it struck me so hard I nearly laughed. She had been terrified of his disappointment, so she built a castle of lies and paid for it with my money, all while I was the one branded the disappointment. My father's chest heaved as he pointed a finger at her. Do you have any idea how many times I've stood in front of neighbors, church friends, even coworkers, and told them how proud I was of you? How many times I said you were the example Claire should follow? Sophie sobbed harder, shaking her head. I didn't mean for it to get this far. The guests sat frozen, no one daring to move. The clinking of glasses and cheerful carols from earlier had been replaced by a suffocating silence. I finally spoke again, my voice steady, but carrying enough weight to slice through the tension. Dad, her apartment alone is almost $3,000 a month. Her car payment is $600. Add utilities, insurance, credit cards, and daily expenses, and she's been short about $4,000 every single month. That's where I came in. Gasps circled the table. A younger cousin muttered something about knowing someone in collections. Aunt Jennifer, who had been watching me with careful eyes all evening, finally spoke. I always suspected something wasn't adding up, she said quietly, her gaze falling on Sophie. Now I see I wasn't wrong. Sophie lifted her head, streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. Claire, please, she begged. Don't do this. Not here. I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. You had no problem letting Dad humiliate me here for years. You sat back and let him say I was wasting my life while I was the one keeping you afloat. So no, Sophie, I won't stop. Her sobs broke louder now, raw and unfiltered. She reached across the table as if to grab my hand, but I pulled mine back. My father pressed both palms flat on the table, his voice a low growl. I can't believe this. I've been lied to, made a fool of. For once I didn't feel the sting of his words aimed at me. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at her. The chatter in the room rose again, relatives whispering, heads shaking. Sophie's carefully crafted image was unraveling in real time, and she knew it. Her eyes darted from one side of the room to the other, desperate for someone to defend her, but no one spoke. Finally, she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Dad, you don't understand. I had no choice. No choice, he snapped. You had every choice. You chose to lie. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she tried to form another excuse, but her voice caught in her throat. I sat back in my chair watching her crumble. For 2 years I had carried her secrets, her lies, her debts. Now they belonged to everyone in that room. The lights from the Christmas tree twinkled against the polished silver on the table, a cruel reminder of how carefully she had decorated her false life. No one applauded this time. No one smiled. The party that had begun with laughter and cheer had turned into a stage, and Sophie's mask had finally fallen. My father sank back into his chair, his shoulders heavy, his eyes still fixed on her. The man who had once seen only her brilliance now stared at her like she was a stranger, and as Sophie wiped at her face with trembling hands, the silence in the room pressed even tighter, waiting for what would come next. My father's voice finally broke the silence, rough and low like gravel. "Sophie, is this true?" He was no longer shouting. The anger had drained into something heavier, something closer to disbelief. Sophie's chin trembled as she looked down at her plate, unable to meet his eyes. "Dad, it is not what you think. Not what I think." His words cracked through the tension. "I think I have been lied to for 2 years while your sister carried the weight of your life on her shoulders." The murmurs around the table grew louder. A cousin whispered to another, and Aunt Mary crossed herself like she was sitting in church. Sophie reached for her napkin, blotting her eyes, but her hand shook so much she nearly knocked over her glass. I leaned forward, my voice steady, not sharp this time. "Dad, her apartment in Cherry Creek alone is close to $3,000 a month. Add the $600 for the car, the insurance, the cards. She was short almost $4,000 every single month. That's where I came in." The guests reacted with a chorus of gasps and disbelieving shakes of their heads. A neighbor who had been invited to the party set his fork down loudly and muttered, "That makes sense. I always wondered how she afforded that place on a retail manager's salary." Sophie's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide, but she had no defense left. My father sat back slowly, his face drained of color. He turned to her again, his words quieter but sharper than before. "You told me you had been promoted to district manager. You told me you were making $90,000 a year." Her lip quivered as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I thought it was coming. I thought if I just made it look like I had it together, maybe it would happen." "You lied," he said simply. She flinched, like the word itself had struck her. For a moment, no one moved. Then Aunt Jennifer placed her napkin neatly on the table and spoke with a calm firmness. "Richard, I think you need to hear this from me. I have watched Claire build her business day and night. She has been steady, reliable, and smart. If anyone here deserves recognition tonight, it is her, not Sophie." Her words seemed to ripple across the table. Several guests nodded, some murmured agreement. My father's eyes flicked toward me, his face shifting, as if he was seeing me differently for the first time. Sophie's sobs filled the air, desperate now. "Claire, please stop this. You promised we would keep it private." I looked at her, my heart pounding but my voice calm. "No, Sophie, you promised you would get it together. You promised you would pay me back. All I did was keep you from drowning while you pretended you were the one swimming." The room went still again. My father's hand rubbed over his jaw as though trying to wipe away the shame. From the far side of the table, one of Sophie's old co-workers, invited as a guest, cleared his throat. "I probably should not say this, but since it is all out now, Sophie never was promoted. She oversees 3 associates at the boutique. That's it." Gasps and whispers erupted again, some sharp, some pitying. Sophie covered her face, her shoulders shaking violently. My father's voice cracked, filled with disbelief. "All this time?" He turned to me, his eyes wide. "And you? What exactly do you make with your business?" I hesitated. For a moment, then spoke clearly, my words ringing in the tense room. "Last year, Summit Provisions brought in $1.2 million. After expenses, I cleared about $600,000. The collective gasp was almost audible. Relatives leaned back in their chairs, eyes wide, murmurs rising louder. A cousin whispered, "That's more than most doctors make." Sophie's sobbing turned into a kind of keening sound. Her makeup streaked down her cheeks, her dress wrinkled from how tightly she was clutching herself. My father stared at me like he had never truly seen me before. His mouth opened, then closed, as though no words could form. He looked down at the wineglass still half full in front of him, then back at me, shame clouding his face. Sophie tried again, her voice hoarse. "Claire, You can't just cut me off. My rent is due in a few days. I have credit cards, my car, my gym membership. The words hung in the air, almost absurd against the weight of everything else. A few guests exchanged glances, some shaking their heads. Maybe you should have thought about that before you let Dad believe you were doing it all on your own, I said, my tone even but unyielding. Sophie sobbed harder, her head dropping into her hands. My father pressed his palms against the table, his voice low and rough. Enough. The party is over. But no one moved. The tree lights twinkled in the corner, casting fractured reflections on the wine glasses, the laughter and music from earlier long gone. And as the silence settled once more, I realized nothing about our family would ever look the same again. My father sat back down slowly, his face pale, as though the weight of the evening had stolen the strength from his legs. The guests shifted in their seats, whispering in low tones that carried more judgment than sympathy. Sophie's sobs grew louder, filling the air, and she clutched at the bracelet on her wrist, as if it could anchor her. Dad's voice cut through the noise, heavy and raw. Sophie, you told me you were making $90,000. You said you had a regional role. He shook his head, his hands trembling against the tablecloth. Was all of it a lie? Sophie lifted her swollen eyes, tears streaking black lines down her cheeks. I just wanted you to be proud of me. I thought if I pretended long enough, maybe it would come true. The words hung in the air, pitiful and hollow. Aunt Mary muttered something about pride coming before the fall, and Uncle Tom sighed, staring into his untouched dessert. My father's face shifted from disbelief to anger, his jaw tight. Do you understand what you have done? He demanded. Do you realize how many times I compared Claire to you, how many times I humiliated her while praising you? Sophie whimpered, pressing the napkin against her face. I didn't think it would go this far. My father's voice rose sharp with betrayal. You stood there and let me believe, let me brag while Claire carried you. The guests stirred, some nodding, others shaking their heads. The room had become a courtroom, and Sophie sat at the center with no defense. I spoke softly, my voice even. Dad, she never corrected you because the lie served her. Every time you called her the successful one, she let you. Every time you called me a failure, she let that stand too. Sophie dropped the napkin, her face blotchy, her mascara nearly gone. It wasn't like that, she cried. I was going to fix it. When I asked, leaning forward slightly, after 2 years, after another 96,000. Or after you finally admitted you were drowning, she shook her head violently, as if she could shake off the truth itself. From the far end of the table, the coworker who had spoken earlier cleared his throat again. For what it's worth, Sophie was never in line for a promotion. Our manager never mentioned her name once. A fresh wave of whispers rolled through the guests. Sophie let out a broken sob, clutching her stomach as though the shame itself had doubled her over. My father's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. For 2 years, he said slowly, I have been parading you as my pride and joy while telling Claire she needed to get her act together. He turned his eyes toward me, his expression twisted with shame. Claire, I don't know what to say. I held his gaze, my heart thudding but my voice steady. There's nothing to say. The truth is out now. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, then his eyes shifted back to Sophie. All those Christmas cards, all those conversations with neighbors, all the times I praised you while mocking your sister. Do you have any idea what that makes me look like? Sophie cried harder, her words stumbling out between sobs. I was scared. I didn't want you to think I was weak. You are not weak because of debt, my father said harshly. You are weak because of lies. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of his voice. The Christmas lights twinkled on, mocking the tension that had drowned out any joy. Aunt Jennifer's voice broke the silence that followed. Richard, you should also see Claire clearly now. She has been the steady one all along. The rest of us have known it. Maybe it is time you did too. His eyes flicked to me again, searching, haunted. Around the table, people nodded in agreement. A cousin, whispered Claire. Has been the one with real grit. Sophie's cries turned desperate, her words tumbling. Claire, please don't cut me off. Please, I can't lose my apartment. I can't live like some nobody. Her words snapped something in me. I looked at her, my voice low but firm. You should have thought about that before you built a life on lies. The room went still again. My father exhaled a heavy breath, rubbing his temple. Sophie stood there, swaying slightly. Her expensive dress, wrinkled, her perfect image shattered before everyone she had worked so hard to impress. Her downfall was complete in that moment, and the silence that followed was louder than her sobs. My father closed his eyes briefly, then opened them, his voice hoarse. I don't even know who you are anymore. And just like that, the pride he had carried for Sophie, all those years, dissolved into nothing. The dining room felt heavier with each breath, as if the air itself had thickened. I could hear the faint tick of the clock in the hallway, steady and unbothered by the chaos around the table. Sophie sat, slumped in her chair, her hands limp in her lap, mascara streaking her cheeks. Her dress, that had shimmered under the lights an hour ago, now clung to her like a costume she no longer fit into. My father's stare stayed on her unblinking. The disappointment in his eyes was something I had never seen directed at Sophie before. It was usually reserved for me, the daughter who supposedly failed to live up to expectations. Now the roles were reversed, and the silence that followed was deafening. I straightened in my chair, feeling the eyes of every guest still on us. Some looked stunned. Others looked vindicated, a few looked uncomfortable, as though they wanted to slip out quietly and pretend they had never seen this spectacle. I caught Aunt Jennifer's gaze across the table. Her face was calm but resolute, her presence like an anchor in the storm. She gave me the smallest nod, as if to say, "Keep going, you have nothing to hide." My father turned toward me, his voice softer now but thick with emotion. "Claire, tell me what you have really been doing. All this time I thought you were wasting away behind a computer, but that is not what I am hearing." For a moment I hesitated. Sharing my success had never felt safe in this family. But something inside me shifted. The truth had already cracked open, and there was no putting it back. I took a steady breath and met his eyes. 4 years ago, I started my own e-commerce company, Summit Provisions. I saw a gap in the outdoor market. People were either buying cheap gear that broke after one trip or paying ridiculous prices for luxury brands. I built relationships with manufacturers across the country, created my own line of products, and sold them online. The guests listened closely, forks forgotten, wine glasses untouched. My words filled the space that had once been occupied by Sophie's stories. Last year alone, I said, we brought in $1.2 million. After expenses and taxes, I cleared about $600,000. The number landed like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed around the table. Someone whispered that it was more than a surgeon made. Another muttered about how they had assumed I was barely scraping by. My father's eyes widened, his mouth parting slightly as though he couldn't form words. Sophie let out a weak cry, her voice hoarse. "She's lying. She has to be lying." Aunt Jennifer spoke firmly, her voice cutting through Sophie's protests. "No, she is not lying. I have known for a long time. I have seen her put in the hours. I have seen the orders, the reviews, the growth. She has built something real, something bigger than most people can dream of." The room shifted again, murmurs of agreement, nods of respect. Sophie's protest died on her lips as she realized no one was siding with her. My father leaned back slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. 1.2 million, he repeated almost to himself. 600,000 clear. All this time I thought you were. He didn't finish. He didn't need to. We both knew what he had thought. I felt my chest tighten, but this time it wasn't with shame. It was release. For years I had swallowed my truth, allowed Sophie to shine while I stayed small. Tonight that ended. Sophie slammed her palms against the table, suddenly startling a few guests. "Stop it. Stop talking like she's some kind of hero. She's not. She's just been lucky." I turned toward her slowly, my voice quiet but firm. "Luck didn't wire $4,000 into your account every month. Luck didn't keep your lights on. That was me." She flinched, her eyes darting toward the floor. My father's chair creaked as he shifted, his face lined with something closer to shame than anger now. "Claire," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology, a big one." For a moment I couldn't speak. The man who had spent years dismissing me was finally seeing me. The weight of it pressed against my chest, almost unbearable. I simply knotted my throat too tight for words. Sophie shook her head violently, her voice shrill. "You are all turning against me. None of you understand how hard it has been." I was trying to keep up, trying to look like I belonged. No one responded. The silence that met her words was more cutting than any rebuttal. My father pressed his palms together, his eyes weary. "Sophie, you need to leave the table." Her head snapped up, shock etched across her face. "Dad, you can't be serious." But he was. His tone left no room for doubt. "Enough. You need to think about what you've done." She looked around the room desperately, her gaze sweeping across the relatives and neighbors who had once adored her. No one met her eyes. Her image, her carefully crafted facade, had collapsed completely. Tears streaming down her face, she pushed back her chair and fled toward the hallway. The sound of her heels on the hardwood echoed long after she disappeared. The room remained hushed, the only sound the faint pop of the fire in the hearth. My father looked down at his hands, then back at me. "Tell me more about your company, Claire," he said quietly. "I want to understand what I dismissed for so long." And in that moment, with Sophie's sobs fading somewhere down the hall, I realized that the story of our family had changed forever. The hallway echoed with the slam of a door, then silence. A few guests shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, but no one dared to stand. My father sat with his hands folded, his wine untouched, his eyes heavy as though the last hour had aged him 10 years. The warm glow of the Christmas tree behind him looked almost cruel against the wreckage of what was supposed to be a celebration. My chest tightened as I tried to steady myself. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was wearing off, leaving behind a strange mixture of exhaustion and clarity. For once, I wasn't the one shrinking in the shadow of my sister. For once, the truth was on the table. The scrape of a chair pulled my attention. It was Mark Stevens, Sophie's boyfriend, who had been sitting 2 seats away from her all night. He had been quiet through the whole ordeal, his face unreadable, but now he stood. He was tall with neat dark hair and a suit that looked like it had been tailored for a banker. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the silence. "I think I should say something," he began, his tone measured. His eyes swept the table, then landed on my father. "Mr. Dawson, I've been dating Sophie for a little over a year. I didn't know about any of this." The room shifted again. Guests leaned in, curious, waiting. Mark's jaw tightened. "She told me she was making close to 6 figures. She told me she had a savings account that she was building toward buying a condo. I believed her. But if what I've heard tonight is true, then I don't know who I've been with." My father's lips pressed into a grim line. Mark continued, his voice colder now. "I work in finance. I know what debt looks like, and I know how destructive it can be. If she's been lying to me the way she's been lying to all of you, then I can't build a life with her." Sophie's muffled sobs carried faintly from down the hall, but she didn't reappear. The guests looked at one another, eyes wide. It wasn't just family anymore. It was Sophie's partner walking away in real time. Mark straightened his jacket, then turned to me. "Claire, I'm sorry you had to carry this burden. You deserved better than to be painted as the failure while covering for her." I managed a small nod, too stunned to speak. With that, he turned and walked toward the door. The sound of it closing behind him was final, like the end of a chapter. The murmurs began again, louder, this time people unable to hold their thoughts back any longer. A cousin whispered that Sophie had bragged about taking Mark on luxury trips. Aunt Mary said she had once asked Sophie for advice about saving money, only to be told smugly that she should just work harder like Sophie had. The hypocrisy cut deeper now that the truth was laid bare. My father rubbed his forehead, his voice hoarse. "God help me, how blind have I been?" I looked at him, and for the first time in years I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, though it came at the cost of my sister's unraveling. The rest of the dinner never recovered. Plates of food sat, cold desserts untouched. Guests excused themselves one by one, offering me quick squeezes on the shoulder or whispered words of support as they left. By the time the house quieted, only close family remained, and even they seemed drained. I went to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water, my hands finally shaking now that the confrontation was over. I leaned against the counter, breathing in the faint scent of cinnamon and roasted ham, trying to gather myself. Behind me, I heard footsteps. I turned to see Aunt Jennifer, walking in her coat draped over her arm, her face calm but kind. She set her things down and reached for my hand. "You did what needed to be done," she said softly. "I know it wasn't easy, but sometimes the truth has to break through even if it hurts." Tears burned the back of my eyes, but I nodded. I just couldn't let it go on. Not tonight. Not in front of everyone while Dad said those things. She squeezed my hand gently. He needed to see it. We all did. Sophie chose her path. Now she has to face it. I swallowed hard, glancing toward the closed door at the end of the hall where Sophie had disappeared. For the first time, I felt no urge to chase after her. No urge to clean up the mess she had made. My father appeared in the doorway, then his shoulders heavy, his eyes rimmed with red. "Claire," he said quietly, "I don't expect you to forgive me tonight. I've been cruel when I should have been supportive. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try." The words settled in me, surprising in their sincerity. I held his gaze, unsure how to respond, but a part of me recognized the moment for what it was. The beginning of a shift. The grandfather clock in the living room chimed the sound, deep and steady. Midnight. Christmas Day. The irony wasn't lost on me. A night that had started with praise and performance had ended in wreckage and revelation. And as I stood in the kitchen, the remnants of laughter and tears still echoing through the house, I knew the real aftermath was only just beginning. 2 weeks later, I sat at my kitchen table in downtown Denver with a stack of mail that had been shoved through my slot. The December snow piled up outside the window, muffling the sounds of the city. I tore open a plain white envelope and unfolded a letter, the words catching my eye immediately. It was a court notice addressed to Sophie Dawson. A collections agency had filed a lawsuit for unpaid balances totaling $85,000. I let the letter drop onto the table, a heavy sigh leaving my chest. It hadn't taken long. Without my monthly transfers, the facade she had built collapsed almost overnight. Aunt Jennifer had called me just the day before, her voice tight. "Sophie's landlord is evicting her, Claire. She is 3 months behind. They have already posted the notice on her door." I closed my eyes, remembering Sophie's glittering posts on social media. The rooftop dinners, the designer bags, the constant performance. All of it was gone now. When I logged into Instagram out of curiosity, I saw that her account had gone private. Most of her old posts had been deleted, as if erasing the pictures could erase the memory. I thought of Mark too. I had heard from a cousin that he never spoke to her again after that night. He packed up his things from her apartment while she was at work and left the key on the counter. Just like that, her carefully crafted relationship dissolved. The sound of my phone buzzing pulled me out of my thoughts. It was a message from Sophie. "Claire, please. I know you hate me right now, but I don't know what to do. They are threatening to garnish my wages. I can't survive like this. Please just help me until I figure things out." I stared at the words, my thumb hovering over the screen. The same desperation I had seen 2 years ago when she sat on my couch was right there in her message, but something inside me had hardened. I typed slowly, my hands steady. "Sophie, I cannot be your safety net anymore. I gave you 2 years. I gave you $96,000. You chose to live a lie. Now you have to deal with the consequences." I hit send, my chest heavy but firm. The next morning, I drove to Commerce City to check on the warehouse where Summit Provisions handled distribution. The loading dock was busy, workers moving pallets of tents and stoves, trucks backing in and out. I walked through the aisles, the shelves lined with gear I had built my name on, and for the first time in weeks, I felt steady. My business was strong. My choices had been sound. When I returned home that evening, there was another message from Aunt Jennifer. She had seen Sophie outside the courthouse clutching a pile of papers, her face pale. The judge had ruled against her, ordering repayment plans she couldn't possibly meet. Bankruptcy was inevitable now. I sat in the quiet of my apartment, the hum of the heater filling the silence, and felt no triumph, only inevitability. The following weekend, I drove past Sophie's old building in Cherry Creek. The lights in her once glamorous apartment were dark. Movers carried boxes down the steps while Sophie stood on the sidewalk, her hair tied back, her coat too thin for the cold. Her eyes caught mine as I slowed at the light. For a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition, then shame. She looked away quickly, focusing on the cracked sidewalk beneath her feet. I didn't stop. By February, she had moved into a small one-bedroom near Colfax Avenue. A cousin told me she had sold most of her jewelry and handbags at a consignment shop just to cover deposits and the first month's rent. Meanwhile, I invested the reclaimed $4,000 each month into expanding Summit provisions. I signed a deal with a supplier in Oregon for a new line of waterproof backpacks. Orders increased. Revenue ticked upward. My time and energy poured into building instead of bailing someone else out, and the difference was staggering. But the damage in the family lingered. Every holiday gathering was quieter. Now my father subdued my relatives, careful with their words. No one dared to mention Sophie's name, though her absence sat heavy at the table. One evening in March, I received a call from Aunt Jennifer. Her voice was steady but concerned. "Claire, I think Sophie has finally hit rock bottom." She came to me asking if she could borrow money. I told her no. I told her she needed to face what she had done, but she looks lost. I sat in silence, the phone pressed against my ear, my heart conflicted. Sophie had taken everything I gave her and turned it into fuel for lies, and now she wanted more. "Thank you for telling me," I said finally. "But I can't step back in." After I hung up, I looked around my apartment, the tidy shelves, the framed photos from hiking trips, the order that had replaced chaos. I thought about Sophie's mess, the trail of unpaid bills, broken trust, and burned bridges. And for the first time, I understood that her downfall wasn't just about money. It was about choices. Choices she had made again and again, until there was nothing left to hold her up. The night was quiet as I stood by the window, the city lights flickering against the snow. Sophie's world had crumbled, and mine finally was steady. And though part of me ached for the girl she once was, I knew this was only the beginning of what she would have to endure. Spring arrived in Denver with bursts of tulips pushing through the thawing soil, but inside our family there was still a chill that no season could melt. My father called me one evening, his voice softer than I remembered. "Claire," he said, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my respect." I sat on my couch, phone pressed to my ear, my heart tightening. For years those words had been impossible to imagine. He went on slowly, as though each word carried weight. "I told neighbors, co-workers, everyone, that Sophie was the responsible one, that you were wasting your time. I used you as an example of failure, Claire, when all along you were the one building something real." The silence between us stretched heavy with years of hurt. I closed my eyes, memories flooding back of every holiday where he praised Sophie and looked at me with disappointment. Hearing him admit it now stirred something I couldn't name. "Dad," I said quietly, "I don't need you to be proud of me because of money. I just wanted you to listen." His voice cracked. "I am listening now." When we hung up, I sat still for a long time, staring at the framed photo on my wall of a hiking trip I had taken years before, just me on a mountain ridge, arms wide to the wind. I realized that was who I had always been, whether my father saw it or not. In April, our extended family gathered for Easter. The table was smaller this time, fewer guests, quieter conversations. Sophie was absent, of course. Her name hung in the air unspoken, though the silence carried her presence more than any words could. When grace was said, my father cleared his throat. His hands shook slightly as he held his fork, and his eyes met mine across the table. "I owe everyone here the truth," he said. For years I praised Sophie as though she carried herself alone, when in fact it was Claire who carried her. I was wrong. I was blind. And I need you all to know I am proud of Claire. Gasps circled the table. Aunt Mary dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Cousins nodded. A warmth spread through my chest, bittersweet but undeniable. After dinner, Aunt Jennifer pulled me aside in the kitchen. "See what honesty does?" she said softly. "You did not just free yourself that night, Claire. You freed him too." Her words lingered long after she left. But outside of our family, Sophie's world kept shrinking. I heard through a friend that her old co-workers whispered about her lies. One even posted a pointed comment online questioning whatever happened to that big promotion she bragged about. Sophie deleted her profile entirely not long after. By May, she had filed for bankruptcy. The court notices were public record. Her credit cards, her car loan, even unpaid medical bills surfaced. She lost the last pieces of her old life in one sweep. One afternoon, my father stopped by my apartment unannounced. He looked smaller somehow, shoulders hunched, a man humbled by his own misjudgments. He asked if he could see where I worked. I showed him my home office, the shelves stacked with samples, the 2 monitors glowing with spreadsheets and orders. I explained how fulfillment worked through the warehouse, how I tracked inventory and negotiated with suppliers. He listened, really listened, his eyes following every gesture, every chart I showed him. When I finished, he nodded slowly. I used to think success only looked one way: suits, titles, buildings with your name on them. He paused, his eyes moist. I could not have been more wrong. I swallowed the lump in my throat. For the first time, he was speaking my language. The next week, I reinvested the money I once gave Sophie into a new campaign to expand Summit provisions into European markets. The response was immediate. Orders doubled and the possibilities stretched wider than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. Meanwhile, Sophie struggled to hold on to anything. She moved into a studio apartment with peeling paint and no dishwasher. A cousin who visited her said the place smelled faintly of mildew, her clothes stuffed into plastic bins because she no longer had a dresser. The image she had spent years building was gone. What was left was just Sophie, raw and exposed, finally forced to live within the limits of her choices. One evening in June, my father invited me to dinner at a small diner near City Park. He slid into the booth across from me, ordered coffee, and folded his hands. "I want to ask you something," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Would you be willing to teach me more about your business?" Not to interfere, but to understand. "I feel like I have missed your entire life." I stared at him, surprised. Then I nodded. "Yes, I can do that." His shoulders eased, and for the first time in decades our conversation flowed. He asked questions, real questions, about customers, about margins, about plans for the future. And I answered openly, without fear of dismissal. When I drove home that night, I realized the greatest change wasn't Sophie's downfall or even my success. It was my father finally seeing me as I truly was. Still, the ache remained. No amount of recognition could erase the years of favoritism, the wounds of comparison. They lingered like faint scars, reminders of what had been lost. And yet, as the summer sun stretched long across the Denver skyline, I knew the balance of our family had shifted forever. By the time autumn rolled in, Denver's trees turning gold along the streets, my life felt steadier than it ever had. The money that once left my account each month now stayed where it belonged, fueling new opportunities for Summit Provisions. I had hired 2 additional employees to manage customer service, and my evenings were no longer consumed with exhaustion. For the first time in years, I could breathe. My father called more often now. Sometimes he asked about suppliers or logistics, but other times he just wanted to hear about my day. His voice carried less authority and more humility, as if he was still learning how to rebuild the relationship he had broken. I let him. I wasn't ready to forget, but I was willing to let him try. Sophie, meanwhile, had faded into the background of our lives. She still worked at the boutique, but word spread quickly about her bankruptcy. Friends who once praised her glamorous lifestyle had drifted away. A cousin told me she rarely posted online anymore, and when she did, her photos looked tired, her smile forced. She no longer lived in Cherry Creek. Her small apartment near Colfax was dimly lit, her furniture a mix of hand-me-downs and thrift store finds. I drove past once late in October. She was sitting on the stoop with a paper bag of groceries at her feet. Her hair tied back, no makeup, her shoulders slumped. She didn't see me, and I didn't stop. A pang of sadness tugged at me, but it was tempered with something else. She was living the life she had always mocked me for, the one within limits, the one that reflected reality instead of fantasy. At Thanksgiving that year, our family gathered again, smaller but calmer. The table was set with turkey, and all the sides, and the chatter was light. No one mentioned Sophie. My father, in a quiet moment after grace, turned to me with a steady voice. "Claire, I want everyone here to know how proud I am of you. Not just for the money, but for the discipline, the courage, the honesty. I spent too long praising the wrong things. I will not make that mistake again." The words landed deep, not because I needed them, but because I had waited so long to hear them. Aunt Jennifer squeezed my shoulder, her eyes soft, and I felt something loosen inside me. By December, as Christmas lights lined the streets again, I thought back to the party the year before. The night when the lies shattered and the truth finally surfaced. The contrast was almost surreal. That evening had ended with tears, broken pride, and slammed doors. This year, I decorated my apartment with simple garlands and a tree I picked out myself. My business had expanded internationally, and I was preparing for a new product launch. I no longer carried the weight of Sophie's choices. On Christmas Eve, my father came to visit me. He brought a small wrapped box awkwardly tied with ribbon. Inside was a framed photo he had found of me as a child, sitting in front of a tent on one of our family camping trips. His handwriting on the back said, "I should have seen your strength then. I am sorry it took me so long." Tears blurred my eyes, but I smiled. "Thank you, Dad." We sat together that evening, sipping coffee, the glow of the tree lights reflecting in the window. For once there was no comparison, no shadow hanging over us. Just quiet recognition, long overdue but deeply felt. Sophie did not come that Christmas. No one expected her to. Her absence was its own presence, a reminder of choices made and bridges burned. But I no longer carried the need to fix her or defend myself. That burden had finally lifted. Looking back, I realized that revenge hadn't been about destroying Sophie. It had been about reclaiming myself, letting the truth speak louder than the lies. Karma had done its work not through cruelty, but through exposure. What she had built on appearances had crumbled, while what I had built in silence had only grown stronger. As the year turned and snow fell softly outside, I knew life would never go back to the way it was. And I didn't want it to. The balance had shifted. The truth had settled. And I had finally found peace in my own story. If you've ever been compared unfairly, if you've ever been dismissed while someone else wore a mask of success, I hope my story resonates with you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if you've faced something similar, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about justice, truth, and the power of finding your own voice.